This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton. Buck, you've been here numerous times.
Always
and
glad to
I
be
must say, the show is lucky to have you, as is this part of the world.
Oh, not at all.
Besides the
Thank you.
obvious
Too
reasons
kind.
having lucky to have you is that you're a great constitutional scholar, and you know a lot about the Constitution, and we have these tiffs that occur periodically. And maybe tonight we can discuss such a tiff involving the Little Sisters of the Poor and the government's attempt to regulate their activities and what's happened. And I'm just going to throw you the softball. This is like a big piece of pecan pie for a constitutional scholar. So what exactly is going on?
Well, first of all, I have to disavow what you said. I wouldn't call myself a great constitutional scholar. What I don't know, I make up.
Okay,
and I try to make it up so convincingly you don't know the difference.
Maybe you should consider politics as a career, no?
and I come on and he insults me, folks, I tell you. Well, yes, Little Sisters of the Poor is it's a case, I think, that really points out more than anything else the threat to traditional American civil liberties, or as much as anything else. I can think of one or two other things in the last 5 or 10 years, but this is right on up there. It begins with the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, and after the passage of Obamacare, Kathleen Sebelius, who was at the time Secretary of Health and Human Services, and who self-identified as a Catholic, issued a mandate, which is a government regulation, not voted on by Congress, not voted on by any legislature.
Now, isn't that's a
Yes.
quite common event, isn't it? So one of the
yes.
things the American
yes.
people need to understand is their lives are being regulated, not so much by laws, but by regulations promulgated by different government entities.
Yes, by bureaucrats who are not elected by the people, who are not chosen by Congress, and in some cases are chosen to terms of years that they can't be gotten out of except through maladministration. And yet these people can issue mandates, can issue government regulations that have the full force of law. And this is one of these regulations that Kathleen Sebelius issued. I think it was in 2013. It was a few years ago.
Now, she just
Yes.
did this independently. Did she? Now, sometimes when people do this, do they ask for opinions? They put
Yes.
in the Federal Register. So they do elicit some kind of opinions.
Yes, and
about
they have periods for public comments that are open for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, which they can then completely ignore if they wish.
Now, do the people have any access to these comments on the regulations?
They
and
do.
are they summated so that you could say, well, we had 75,000 people against it and 1 million for it? Or
I'm not sure if they get tabulated like that, but all these things are public record.
Yes.
And every day the Federal Register is published. It's about as thick as a national, well, thicker than that, but it's fairly thick as a thin phone book. Every day it comes out. Showing what every government agency has issued or proposed for that
Now,
day.
a normal human, shall we say, walking down Cherry Street, chewing bubble gum and bouncing a basket, whatever the normal life is,
Yes.
it would not be a normal thing to check out. Is that right? People don't normally check out the Federal Register.
That is correct.
The citizens that inhabit this part of the world, it would be quite unusual.
That is correct. Now, I will say, in honesty, that in the age of the internet, it is rather easier. It's considerably easier
Yes.
for the average person in the street, if he were interested in doing so and knew
Yes.
to do so, to be able to check these
Now,
things.
aren't there a plethora of regulations out there? So let's say there's something that's particularly onerous that appears, and there's a bird dog that's going after. I read this. Tells his wife
Yes.
every day. Well, I'm going to read the Federal Register. I have to think, whatever. So it must be an enormous document, and finding the little minutia that might affect things is not an easy task.
Yes, and this is why God made watchdog agencies
Yes.
and lobbying agencies, because generally speaking, if there is an interest group out there, who knows, the Sierra Club or People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, they know generally what to look for. They know what agencies to track. But the average person, not so much.
And so, okay, so pretty much these bureaucrats can propagate regulations as they wish, and they do have some public comment about it.
Yes.
But so what? And then there's no requirement that they respond to these comments. Is that a fair statement?
Usually there is not. So, and the bureaucracy, I like to point out, we have three branches of government at the federal level. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that we don't want any one group of people exercising executive and legislative and judicial authority.
Yes.
Well, the executive branch is by far the biggest. There's something like 2 million federal employees.
Yes.
And at the top level, you have these bureaucrats, such as department secretaries or agency secretaries.
Right.
And they exercise all three things. They issue law, in the form of executive agency regulations, they interpret them, they enforce them.
Right.
So there's no separation of powers, and these people are not even responsible directly to the electorate.
All right, well, so what happened in our little story here with the Little Sisters of the Poor, who a very sympathetic group, I must say.
Indeed,
but
they are.
Continue.
Well, yes. Every once in a while, when you're going to sue the government, you try to find the most sympathetic plaintiffs that you can. Rosa Parks was a wonderfully sympathetic plaintiff. She had everything going for her.
Right.
Little Sisters of the Poor. Well, Sebelius issued this regulation requiring religious institutions to secure health insurance under Obamacare for their employees that included coverage for sterilization procedures and contraception.
Yes.
And as you know, that there is both, I think, in terms of philosophy and in terms of biology, a huge debate over whether or not some forms of contraceptives are in fact more contragestives, that they permit conception and prohibit implantation.
Yes.
So, and if life begins at conception, then you're talking essentially the same ethical, moral dilemma as is present in abortion.
So, in other words, these very vonderful group of ladies who have very strong moral viewpoints, the government said to them, actually, via this regulation, well, we've decided what you're going to do and not do. And we've decided this is what we're going to do. The state is going to exercise its control over you and your lives, and we're going to say what the deal is.
Yes. Well, the government does that all the time to all of us.
That's right, and that's another springboard for conversation. But that I was throwing a leading question out there. But okay.
Yes.
Good.
So yes, in this case, the government, in the person of Kathleen Sebelius, is saying that you must, under penalty of forfeiture of huge sums of money, must participate in activity that would for you constitute mortal sin, that would end up sending you to hell.
Now, I understand that the fines were amounting to about $70 million a year.
Correct.
Which would have basically destroyed their I guess the sisterhood, or destroy their order, would be destroyed by this enormous punitive fine. $70 million. Now, where did that number come from? Who makes up? I mean, I'm going to find. You can imagine how powerful the government is if they said, "Well, I didn't like you're walking your dog too much, or we're going to fine you $1 million." These numbers are catastrophic numbers, and is there any kind of control or regulation over fines the government arbitrarily tax or throws against people?
I'm not sure if those fines are buried somewhere in the 1,000 pages of Obamacare or were adopted once again by HHS pursuant to this mandate. If they are in fact punitive fines, a compensatory fines are designed to put the party back into the position he would have been if the injury or the breach of contract hadn't happened. Something punitive is designed essentially to hurt the party and therefore coerce or
well, isn't this
behavior.
the case here? In other words, the $70 million was not going to be refunded. I don't know, maybe there's some, janitor that worked for the order or whatever.
Yes.
But this money was going straight into the government coffers.
Yes.
And is it fair to say this was a punitive effort, a coercive, punitive effort on the part of the government to impinge on religious freedom. I mean, I let the cat out of the bag, but okay.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but it seems very targeted, and there was some backlash here, and Obama himself got involved and announced a compromise. But the compromise was even worse because it touched any aspect of what a religious order is trying to do, like, for instance, run a hospital.
Yes.
And I must say, speaking of the Little Sisters of the Poor in particular, they are an order of beggars, that they do not accept regular sources of income. Their founder actually went door to door with a basket asking for people to donate money to care for the...
See me shake my head.
No, to care for the elderly and the infirm. And to this day, that's what they do. They are beggars, and that's all they do. Their vocation, their mission, is to care for the poor and elderly. That's their job. So,
well, you know, I'm getting pretty provoked by this story, but yes. I will hold my keep my powder dry a bit there. Well, so the government has there kind of a conflict here that the religious freedom and the authority your conscience has over your behavior,
yes.
and then some kind of regulation that's being propagated by the government, presumably with the idea that there's another set of people that need to be protected here.
Yes.
So the government is saying we're going to protect people that basically want, I don't know, reproductive rights, I guess I would phrase it that way. So they are creating a set of rights.
Yes.
And they're putting these rights in there, and we've made this analogy before. When you have sort of a zero-sum game, you
yes.
have these balloons here, and you start pumping up the reproductive right
yes.
balloon, and it just pushes everything else out of the way.
Yes, this is the sort of situation in which one person's right is another person's duty.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And by the way, of the Bill of Rights, the right that the political left holds most sacrosanct now is a right that is not textually mentioned in the Constitution. It is this highly nebulous right to privacy, which in 99.9% of cases has something to do with sex.
Yes, well,
So
I mean,
the First Amendment must fall to it, the Fourth Amendment must fall to it, the Fifth Amendment must fall to it, the Sixth Amendment must fall to it. So
now
yes.
we're on, you know, it's sort of, I mean, I'm going to try and be neutral about this subject, but the idea is, well, okay, we have a different makeup of American people. The American people want this, they want that. There's a group of people that want a particular viewpoint. And so the courts just create a protection for this viewpoint out of whole cloth, and you could make you could really say there's no limit to what an active court could do.
Yes.
I mean, they could say anything, basically a right of privacy, or they could manufacture any viewpoint on any subject that matches their constituency's desires. Well, okay, so this is the sort of thing that happens. And then what is the process by which we arrived at the Supreme Court decision recently on the subject?
Well, several different plaintiffs, of whom the Little Sisters of the Poor was merely one. There were several Catholic organizations, for instance, Priests for Life. There were evangelical organizations as well, Geneva College, who found common cause here. And they all brought lawsuits in various regions of the country. In several cases, the courts decided against them. In a few cases, the courts decided for them. The cases were consolidated on appeal, and finally, this consolidated case made it to the Supreme Court a few months ago.
Now, this is a very expensive process. So a normal plaintiff, I mean, would
yes.
have if you were Joe Blow on the street and the government did something to you about walking your dog, I mean, it would be almost impossible for a solitary citizen to stand up against the power of these regulations. There'd just be no way you could do it. And you would then be basically subjected to the full force of the American government's power.
But he's not biased, folks, not at all.
Well, no, I mean,
no, you're right. We're coming down pretty hard. I agree with you.
I mean,
I do agree with you.
this irritates me.
Yes.
It irritates me.
Yeah,
I don't like that.
It takes typically, if you're not dealing pro bono or something, it takes millions of dollars to litigate a case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right, okay.
So, and this is millions of dollars times about a dozen.
Right.
So, and so what the court has done, and I'm sure that the rather shocking death, because I didn't see it coming, most people didn't, but the death of Justice Scalia,
yes,
which has, I think, thrown the court out of balance
Right.
and thrown a lot of things up into the air, probably resulted in I don't know, an agreement to disagree that we have seen today. What the court has done is to send all of these cases back down to the lower courts, the courts of appeal, and vacated the judgments of these courts. That means that that the decisions that these lower courts have reached no longer are in force, and that therefore, if the plaintiffs wish to go forward, they're going to have to be relitigated.
Now, just to ask this question, presumably these fines have the fines been held in abeyance?
They have.
So it
As
could
part
be
of
that
vacating.
if they lose this number, the $70 million number, presumably is just racing up. Those numbers are increasing.
Yes.
And there could be some kind of interest attached to them. I mean, you've disobeyed the government in regards to this for, I don't know, 5 years, $70 million a year. We're now up to whatever
Yes.
interest, penalties. Some kind of extraordinary destructive judgment could be reached. So it's still out there. And,
Yes.
and also, the plaintiffs have the expense of continuing. It's not expensive for the government to do this, but the plaintiffs going against the government is going to require additional money and additional resources to fight this thing out. Is that correct?
That's correct. What the government would like to do is for the plaintiffs figuratively simply to roll over and play dead. If that happens, government wins, plaintiffs lose.
Do you
Plaintiffs
owe
do what government
$300
wants.
million or whatever if you just let this go?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, so.
Well, now, one of the things, well, at least we can discuss this. I mean, I said this is terrible, these things happen, but there was some kind of recourse against this government overreach, in my opinion. I hope that's not too extraordinary to say that, but some kind of way to right the wrong, and they went through the courts.
Yes.
So anybody could do that. Does anybody have the right to say, you know, this regulation about walking my dog, they're not letting me do it, impinges on my privacy right, shall I say?
Yes.
I mean, I've got whatever right you want to say has been abridged upon. What happens? You say I want to go to court, and the courts are going to do something about this, or
Well, you're going to ask the court to do something.
the
There
lower
are-
courts.
Yes. You would start usually in federal district court if you're talking about a federal regulation or a federal law. And you have to jump through certain hoops. There has to be a real injury, a substantial injury, an injury of the sort for which the court can actually give redress. So, for instance, let's say the Little Sisters of the Poor, for whatever reason, were not interested in filing a lawsuit.
Yes.
I could not file a lawsuit
Right.
on their behalf.
So you have-
But these are
But so
fairly
there
basic
is some
things.
way
Yes.
to write that, you know, when there's this overreach
Yes.
by the government. Now, just to ask this question, there are thousands and thousands of these regulations being promulgated. How unusual is it for somebody to prevail in the courts against such regulations? And just to ask the question, if we have 100,000 new regulations being promulgated every year, and then how many of them can successfully be reversed in
Yes.
this expensive process in the
Yes.
courts? Is that a big number or a
Well,
little number?
I can't give you any stats. I will say it depends on the type of case. If it's a case that simply involves property,
Yes.
then the courts tend to be very deferential to what the government has done in that
Yes.
case. If what is involved are personal liberties,
Yes, right.
then the courts tend to be rather more solicitous of those.
Yes, right.
And if you're dealing with something such as racial discrimination,
Yes.
then the courts tend to be very solicitous
Yes.
of those charges.
Yes, yes.
So it really depends on the type of
I
of
see.
thing you're
And
dealing
so, in a way, not to overkill this, but you could say whatever these balloons, we're talking about
Yes.
inflating balloons, there used to be a big balloon here,
Yes.
which was private property,
Yes.
the right to property, and that balloon has just been pushed way, way, way down.
Correct.
So it's getting to be a very suspect kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, all right, so this went to the Supreme Court. Now, and you mentioned that Justice Scalia wasn't there. It was a 4-4 decision. I mean, what do you think went into the justices' minds to basically, they just passed on this,
Yes.
didn't they? They
Well-
could have said, well, we're going to reverse. The government has just totally overreached. And if they'd done that, if the religious liberty wins in this dispute, I mean, doesn't that make law? I mean, the government is going to
That's-
have to back down everywhere in
Yes.
regards to this.
Theoretically, yes. Yeah, the issue here, what was being tried here, the Little Sisters of the Poor and all the other plaintiffs were essentially arguing a free exercise issue here. And at the federal level, this still involves the Sherbert test, which the court adopted back in the early 1960s, which I think was a good test. I think most civil libertarians believed was a good test, and which, ironically, Justice Scalia took the lead in undermining in 1990. And my guess was that Scalia would never have undermined that test if he had seen into the future 15 or 20 years the things were going to develop.
Yes,
I think that somewhere Scalia is kicking himself for now for doing that. But we still have the test in some circumstances, and it's a 4-part test. Number one, does the regulation involve a sincere religious belief? Well, with the Little Sisters of the Poor, I think you got a sincere religious belief. You've got a doctrine of the church that goes back 2,000 years.
Yes,
They're nuns, for Pete's sake. The next question is, if you've got a sincere religious belief, is the regulation a substantial burden? Not a slight burden, not a moderate burden. It's got to be a substantial burden on that religious belief. And once again, we're talking, a Catholic would refer to this as material cooperation in evil.
Yes.
If you've told me you're going to shoot that fellow and I hand you a gun,
yes.
I understand.
Yeah.
And so, since this would be a substantial burden because you'd be committing a mortal sin and jeopardizing your soul. So if the answer to both of those questions is yes, if the answer is no to either question, plaintiff loses. Too bad deal.
Right, yes.
If the question to both of those questions is yes, then the burden shifts to the government.
Yes.
The government must show two things. Number one, that it is pursuing a compelling interest.
Yes.
Once again, not a slight interest, not a moderate interest, but a somebody's going to die kind of interest.
Right, yes.
And that this regulation is the least restrictive means possible to achieve that interest.
Yes.
Now, what the court has done here is to say we are not deciding any of that. Because during arguments, the government has conceded that it can possibly find another way to achieve this contraceptive and sterilization coverage without the Little Sisters of the Poor having to sign off on it.
Yes.
And since you've got that, you may have grounds for an agreement. So since all of the lower court decisions were based on the premise that there could be no agreement, we're going to try to skirt the issue here. And without deciding this First Amendment issue, without deciding of whether or not you've got a substantial burden or compelling interest, we're just vacating the decisions and sending it back.
Now, one of the things that interests me in your dissertation is that, there are several things, but one of them is that the Justice Department before it reached the Supreme Court, there was no sense of compromise. So in looking at this, they say there's no other way to do this.
Which is patently ridiculous on its face.
So just the way the Justice Department works, I mean, I'm an American citizen. If they're doing something that seems to me onerous and wrong, what do you do about that? Do you call your congressman? Do you say, whatever, the Justice Department is way off base on this? I mean, what control does an American citizen have on the overreach of the Justice Department? This is an executive branch, and what does Congress do about this? If the Justice Department it seems like they waffled on this, and an external observer would say, well, this is an election year.
Yes.
And so is this the way the deal is? The Justice Department does pretty much the bidding of its masters, and whoever the political masters are is the party in charge. And I mean, it might well be the Republicans could be in charge, and they could tell the Justice Department what to do. And the Justice Department could be as I guess wrong-headed on the right also. They could just do whatever they want. They could do anything that's unreasonable, and there'd be no way for let's say, any other branch to stop them.
Yes.
So is there a way to stop that kind of behavior?
Well, the way you normally do it is win an election. But when you're dealing, now Sebelius was, of course, Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Right.
She serves at the pleasure of the president.
Yes.
So in that case, you could say, well, elect a president of a different party, and he will hire and fire someone else.
That's a pretty clumsy way to rectify things over a 4-year period. I mean, it's very
especially with a lame duck president.
Yes,
so,
yes.
And if you're dealing with an independent agency, where somebody is appointed by the president and then serves for a term of years, even getting rid of the president is not going to change things in the short term.
Right. Well, can Congress do something? Can they say...
They could abolish the department, but good
no,
luck
there's
with
nothing
that,
they could... So really, the Justice Department is a very powerful institution
Yes.
that can say anything they want to, and seemingly they waffled on this. So what it looks like an external observer would say, okay, we've come right down to the nitty-gritty here. It's going all the way to the Supreme Court, and you have, for several years, refused to make any kind of compromise.
Yes, but now you've
and then
blinked.
you show up there.
Yes.
Well, I mean, what it to me as an external observer, there needs to be some kind of investigation about why the Justice Department waffled
Well, it's
on it.
actually Health and Human Services.
All right.
But
Well,
same difference.
Well, now, is it?
So-
In other words, the Justice Department is representing health and who is it that said
Well,
there's
this
no
is-
way to? It's the person that promulgated the regulation. There is no way we can compromise.
Yes.
Absolutely zero. There's no
Yeah,
way in the earth.
Yes, the defendant in this case is the Secretary of Health and Human
And the
Services.
Justice Department said, okay, if that's what you say, that's what it is. So did the HEW, or Human Resources, are they the people that waffled, or did the Justice Department waffle on this?
I don't have an answer for that because I just simply I read the per curiam decision when it came out, and it simply said the government. So I don't know what negotiations have been going on or whether this was conceded at argument. But that shows that this, as you called it earlier, strong arm tactics. That it was not until the justices said, "Can't you do this a different way?" that they started saying, well, yeah, maybe we could do
Okay,
that.
I'm going to
So-
be very extreme here. I'm going to say these are not strong arm tactics. These are Gestapo type tactics that have no place in our country. So, I mean, in other words, if the government is acting this way in such a cavalier, disrespectful manner, then there needs to be some kind of appropriate change. This is not a good thing. And I mean, and the fact is there's not enough discussion about the way the country is going, in my opinion. I mean, so, and the right is easily be as wicked. I mean, the wickedness is anywhere. I mean, the Republican Party had plenty of wickedness. Anybody could.
Yes.
I mean, but if the power, if power is so strongly concentrated in an administrative body, and the administrative body has no comeuppance anywhere other than the most indirect of comeuppances, then the system needs to be altered. I mean, do you have any comments about that?
Well, I think part of it is that for many years we had in this country what was called the liberal consensus, whereby we all tended more or less either to agree or to be able to reach an agreement after debate. But as our pendulum has swung, as our parties, both of them, Republican, Democrat, have gotten more and more extreme and partisan in the culture wars, you see each side trying to bully the other side more. And this was a classic example of it. And of course, the Catholic Church is the best target because it's the biggest, it is institutionally the richest, it has some of the strongest and oldest statements on the issue of human sexuality and reproductive rights and obligations of anybody. They are the biggest charitable institution in human history, and therefore they are the biggest competitor for the federal government and the agenda of the left with its non-textual rights to privacy. And I do think it ironic that a lot of this attack on the church is being headed by self-described Catholics such as Melinda Gates, Kathleen Sebelius, Nancy Pelosi. I could go on. And that Sotomayor on the Supreme Court often sides with the left on this. So this is something of a civil war between the secular arm and the religious.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation here. I hope we didn't offend anyone out there.
I'm
but
sure we
but
did,
if we
but
did, too bad.
we try to be equal offenders,
All right,
yes.
thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thank you. Good to have you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national and international basis.